Right, okay, well, I'm delighted on behalf of DURA as well as the university in general to welcome award-winning writer Denise Mina to our interview room here at the 2013 Dundee Literary Festival, this is the Friday the 25th of October. Denise has enjoyed a very successful literary career since publishing her debut novel Garnet Hill in 1998, which won the John Creasy Dagger for the best first crime novel, and she's become recognised as one of Scotland's leading crime writers. This is, of course, as well as lending her considerable talents to such diverse projects as A Drunk Woman Looks at the Thistle, a play based upon Hugh MacDiarmid's A Modernist poem, A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle, to other projects such as her run as lead writer on the dark horror fantasy graphic novel series Hellblazer. So welcome, Denise.
Thank you very much.
How's Dundee treating you? Well?
Very well.
Good.
I was beaten up on the way here, but apart from that, it's been going great.
Oh, you're from Glasgow, sure. You can take that.
No, it's too rough this time.
So just by way of introduction, if you'd like to tell us maybe some of the context of your writing, maybe kind of your background before, well, not necessarily before a writer, but before publication, kind of your road towards that.
Well, I did law at Glasgow, and I was doing a PhD in the ascription of mental illness to female offenders at Strathclyde, and so all of the ideas from that thesis are in my first book, because I sort of realised that nobody would read my thesis, but if I put it in a crime novel, people would read to find out who had done the crime. Yeah. So, you know, it seemed like a much better way to disseminate the ideas in the PhD, which were, I thought, really, they were other people's, but I thought they were really interesting ideas, and I thought nobody would read them if they were in a thesis, but if it was in a crime novel and it was entertaining and it was personal and it was engaging, then that would be a much better way to disseminate political ideas.
Yeah, I think that definitely comes through, like the psychological ideas in your novel, but I'm kind of going to pull for a question that I heard earlier. It's quite an interesting question from the panel I was at this morning. Like, when did you first self-identify as a writer? When did you first walk up to someone and say, I am a writer? Was it before you were published? Was it after you were published? When did that kind of happen for you?
It was about 6 books in.
Right.
Because before that I just felt like it was such an arrogant thing to say about yourself, and also, you know, it's always a struggle to be a writer and not become a wanker. I don't know if I can say that. But it's a big struggle.
You've said it now.
Okay, but it is a real struggle because it's such a high social status thing, but you haven't changed, and you go from being the fat waitress nobody really wanted to re-employ to being a writer.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily change what you're writing either.
It doesn't change who you are, what you're interested in, or how you see the world, or the fact that you have a deviant social identity, and so I could never say I was a writer, and on my passport I said I was a researcher, because I just couldn't say I was a writer, and so I'd had about 6 books published, and then I had to get a new passport, and I said, you know, just put writer, and then I thought, I'm going to regret that, because you're going through passport control, you've been up all night, you're knackered, you don't want someone to say, oh, what sort of books do you write? I write crime, maybe I'll have heard of you, what's your name, Denise Mina? No, I've never ever heard of you. You know, it's quite a complicated conversation. So, but I mean, it was a long time before, and I still feel like a phony. But I think that's a sign that you're grateful, and I think it's important to stay grateful.
Yeah, you're not taking it for granted.
Yeah,
so maybe a bit of a redundant question after the event that we've just come from, like, this question about public speaking, I think it obviously came across that you do enjoy kind of the public speaking aspect of it, and kind of, you know, the wisecracking and all that. But does it change kind of how you view your relationship to your readership, if you like? Does it make that closer? Does it change that in what you imagined your readership would be? Well,
I think readings are a very strange form of kind of very dull theatre. I think they're not your readership, because they're all women of a certain age, pretty much, and students who are contractually obliged to come. So there are very few young guys there, and quite a lot of young guys read my books. Yeah. There are very few women who are, you know, kind of, I mean, I don't know, it's just a reading is a very strange thing, and it's not your readership. And also public speaking is a very strange thing, and it's not you really, it's you saying things in a certain way and making sure you don't talk too long, which I don't do often enough, and it's quite an awkward kind of interaction, and then you meet people afterwards, but you're not really meeting your readers, because you've talked for an hour and then people come up and they just blurb at you because they're sort of trying to redress
it's more like a wall, it's more like performance
audience.
Yes,
it is, you know, and I mean, it's an interesting thing to do, but it's, you know, I think the writing and readers are very different than public readings.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's a different
Yeah.
audience, and you're different than you really are, and it's a bit of a kind of phony social construct, really.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay, well, I wanted to kind of maybe tease out the publishing aspect of things more. Like, I've watched previous interviews where you've kind of described your road to publishing as like a fairy tale, like a fairy story, and there's you don't really want to kind of lay out the exact steps. There's not an exact formula to becoming a successful writer. You don't want to lay out false hope for anyone. But Garnet Hill, you wrote that during your PhD at Strathclyde, is that
I misused my grant.
which turned out to be a great thing.
Well, for me,
But for you, yeah.
they're down a grant, so I
Was
don't know if
that-
they would say that.
Was that like the first kind of fully formed thing you had ever written, or was that more kind of like a culmination of things you'd written before?
No, I'd written maybe 6 chapters of a book before, and I showed it to someone, and they said it needs rewritten, and then I didn't write anything for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the problems with publishing and being self-promoting now is, lots of people. I was very quick to believe bad news about myself.
Yeah.
And if someone said you shouldn't be a writer, I just believed them immediately. And I still find, I always think, do you know my mum if I get a good review or something like that? Do you know what I mean? And I think a lot of those writers are getting lost in the melee, I forgot the question. What was the question again? Sorry.
It was about publishing, and was that like your process to like Garnet Hill basically? Was that kind of the first fully formed thing?
Yeah, no, but Garnet Hill I hadn't finished.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote the first maybe 100 pages.
Yeah.
And then I was about 32 and I was an academic, and I wasn't very committed to being an academic, and I kept thinking, well, I'm doing this legal research, but really I'm a writer. And then in my head I just thought, try it and stop having this phony fantasy second life. So I sent it off to 4 agents, and saying I finished this book, which I hadn't, and I'm a massive extrovert and I love attention, which I didn't at all, and public speaking is something I've really learned. I mean, I could not speak publicly at the beginning, but I've basically been doing it a long time, and I told a whole lot of lies about myself, and one of them wrote back and said, can we see the rest of it? So I had to sit down and write the rest of it in 3 months, and then I sent it to them, and that was the book that got published.
Oh, very good.
I know.
Not bad. So I wanted to talk kind of a little bit about the latest novel, The Red Road. It's kind of was it much of a different experience writing it, because it is kind of larger in scope than most things that you've done in the past in terms of the time scale. And you start like in a very definite place in '97 with the night that Diana died. So I mean, and in terms of your other work as well, kind of bringing like real life events into things, that was like kind of raised in the event as well. So how was that as an experience for you to write?
It was a great book to write, and I really I was felt slightly baffled at the end, because it really felt like maturing as a writer, and I think the more you write, the more assured you become.
Yeah.
I think I have kids, and if you have kids, you don't have all the time to sit and think bad thoughts about your work, or fret about whether or not you'll be able to do it. I just did it, and it felt a much more confident book. Like I really kind of knew what I was doing, where I was going with it, and how it was supposed to come out, and that because I've always used real crimes in my books, but using real historical events felt that I think you set crime novels tend to be set in a particular geographical area, and that gives them a sort of believability. And I think if you set it in particular historical periods or around historical events, it gives it a real believability as well. It just lends it the same sort of thing. Yeah,
well, I mean, that's something that I wanted to talk about as well, because obviously you're from Glasgow, your novels are very kind of connected to Glasgow, as well as like other things that you've done. Is that important for you to have that kind of Glaswegian kind of authenticity, if you like, to your novel? And is there any kind of you're very often kind of introduced as a Glaswegian crime writer? Is that kind of a pigeonhole you want to avoid, or is it just something that's there now that happens?
Do you know, I'm not from Glasgow. I grew up in Paris and Norway, and I lived in South London when I was a teenager, and I came to Glasgow because I ran out of money, and I happened to have the Glaswegian accent because my parents were Glaswegian, but I came to Glasgow and I just sort of fell in love with it, and so. But I don't see Glasgow as, a small backwater. I see it as a universal city. I think all
Yeah.
cities are universal. If it's London, you tend to think that's a universal city, or if it's New York, you think it's a universal city. But if it's anywhere that isn't one of those capital cities, you think it's that small, strange region. But that's that's another. You know, you're sort of framing that as the other. So anywhere that you don't live is other.
Yeah.
You know. But because I live in Glasgow, I think it's a really interesting microcosm of all cities, and it's a good size because you can walk across it and everybody talks to each other.
Yeah.
Those are the unique kind of things about it.
Yeah, there's a sense of familiarity there.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's kind of connected to that. This idea of tartan noir that keeps coming up, is that it's possibly the most unspecific thing that anyone has ever kind of tried to pigeonhole anyone in. And I've read, or I've seen a couple of interviews with Ian Rankin where he talks about it as, you know, on one side a positive thing is, you know, bringing these kind of new attention to Scottish crime, but it's also kind of lumping you all into the same kind of bandwagon, whereas, you know, something like Norwegian noir is very kind of specific, that's been developed, you know, by like the popularity of the Stieg Larsson novels and, you know, the killing and things that you've mentioned in the event. So tartan noir, what's your take on it?
Well, you know, it's such a broad church now.
Yeah.
I mean, I can think off the top of my head of 20 writers who are writing crime fiction set in Scotland, and there was a period about 5 years ago where I thought if you threw a brick in Sucky Hall Street on a Saturday, you'd hit someone who was writing a crime novel. And I actually heard a conversation in a pub and someone said, "I'm writing a crime novel," and everyone at the table groaned. But that's brilliant because, you know, it means that publishers are looking for the next big seller. They're, you know, focused on Scottish crime fiction, and I think actually maybe it does have a bit more in common than we suppose. We're too close up to the glass to see it really, which is it's quite urban, it's quite noir, and we are quite obsessed with politics, and we do talk about politics in our everyday life. If you go somewhere like London, people do not talk about politics. They say Boris Johnson's funny, but they don't really have that culture of pub arguments, you know, where people, you know, kind of disagree with one another and debate things, or, you know, and so I think those things are very Scottish, but you know, it is such a broad church that you can't really, but I mean, it's interesting that so many people in Scotland feel that that's a form that's, you know, usable for them. Do you know what I mean? That it's, you know, you know, I mean, there's lots and lots of us, but who'll be remembered? We don't know, you know, I mean, maybe we'll all be forgotten, it'll just be McIlvanney, you know, I mean, history's replete with million-seller crime fiction books that no one remembers. Chekhov wrote a crime fiction book, which was awful. It's called The Shooting Party, but the reason he wrote it was because there was a guy from New Zealand who wrote a crime fiction book called something like The Fog of London, and he became a millionaire, and I think he bought like half of Australia with all the money, and so Chekhov wanted to do that and make lots and lots of money so he could go off and write the stuff he really wanted to write, which is like a sort of pattern that lots of people follow, you know, so, you know, we don't really know what's significant yet because we're too deep into it, but we'll see.
I'd like to give that a little read then, Chekhov's
The Shooting Party.
The Shooting Party.
It's bloody awful. It's awful. It's a cross between a crime novel and a gothic novel because they were like two big genres at the time, and it's just lump and crap. I mean, it really is. It's really makes you feel great about your work because you think, well, he wrote this shit, but he had that in him. Do you know what I mean? He had to strive and be poor.
Speaking of kind of, well, be remembered is kind of a horrible way to put it, but literary prizes is something you kind of talked about in the event as well. And what does that have any real effect on your day to day or how you think people view your work? Because, you know, you were talking in the event about you don't really think that crime writers should be put into the Booker Prize because, you know, there's the huge disparity in sales and profit and all that kind of thing. So, I mean, what's your take? Because you know you've got a lot of awards. You know, like the End of the Wasp season won multiple awards. Has that made any real difference to you?
I think it makes you much more confident about your work, and then ultimately makes you feel a wee bit cheap. And because if you actually think about it, you know, what does it mean? It means that people that you've never met approve of you.
Yeah. And
then the next year you're not up for it and you think, oh, those people I've never met who approved of me last year think I did really badly this year. It's quite a fraught kind of process. But I think what it's really about is you're making things that you really love and then you're taking them to a market, which is a sort of, you know, it's a sort of juncture that people are very unaware of. They know instinctively that something funky's going on, and then they have to go and sell their products, and other people have to sell it. And prizes are part of that sale thing. But the important thing is to make things with integrity in the first place. That they're not the same thing, you know, and you don't want to mix them up. And it's just the game. The game is you go to lots of literary festivals and you feel like a fool, and nobody comes to your event, and you don't sell books, and the book that you really love everyone hates, and all that, you know, and then you win a prize, and then there's a consensus of opinion. I mean, there's an artist who says, you know, to be a very successful artist is to be misunderstood by millions. So, you know, because I don't think I'm writing for 1 million people. I think I'm writing for a small group of people. And I did a reading in LA once, and there were 4 people at that reading. And I'm still in touch with all of those people. Right. It was like the best reading I've ever done. And sometimes when I'm sitting in front of 500, I think those 4 people are in there somewhere. Yeah. And they'll be too shy to come up and talk to me at the end. Do you know what I mean?
And it comes back to the kind of audience, kind of performer thing we were talking about before.
Yeah.
You know, if there's 4 people, it's a lot kind of more intimate.
It's much more intimate, and you know, writing and people reading your work is very intimate. But then you get to the point where people are reading your books and not really understanding them, having no particular draw to them, reading them because their pals are reading them, and not really getting them, but kind of they're too embarrassed to say because the consensus is it's quite a good book, but it's not that book that really gets them. Like everyone has a few books that really get them. Do you know what I mean? But then, you know, if you are a writer, you're aware that when you're up, there's always a down coming, and you meet other writers who have been massive, and now no one's buying their books and they can't get arrested. So we'll go back to the intimate groups of 4 again.
Quite happily, yeah.
And I'll hate it.
So you're probably going to hate me for this question. Kind of first of all, I've seen a few other people ask you this, and I think you've come up with a different answer every time, which is quite interesting. But first of all, what's your opinion on interviewers that ask you what your favourite of your novels is? This was kind of touched on in the event. And then, what is your favourite novel? Be honest.
Oh, well, it's different every day. Today, it's actually the last one, actually.
Oh, yeah.
And that's partly because I found out yesterday from my publisher that I don't have to hand the next one in.
Right.
In like 2 months. So I feel like I can, because it's been a really mad kind of turnaround time, and I feel like I can kind of relax a wee bit and sort of enjoy the fact, because I don't feel that as if that book's even come out actually. Yeah. I feel like I've just gone straight into writing another book. So I feel like I can kind of sit and enjoy that book, you know. But one of my favourite books was Sanctum, which everyone hated.
I've heard you. Yeah, Sanctum was the one that
was my ugly baby. Yeah, and. Which I've got a real soft spot for actually, and just I mean in America it did brilliantly, but I think you have to lose your audience every so often if you're moving on as a writer. Yeah, you know you can't or write the same book over and over again, and I wrote the Garnet Hill books, which were about super feisty, crazy lady, fighting crime, and then I wrote a book about a middle class house husband who's quite self-indulgent, and people were just kind of like.
Yeah, it's almost like cleansing the palate and moving on to something else.
Well, just, you know, you're supposed to develop, you know, and I know writers who haven't moved on and they're still writing the same book and they wished they had. They really wished they had. But there's a lot of money in crime writing, and the you know, the business side of it wants you to keep making the money, and the way to keep making the money is to write the same book and change the names, you know, and some people don't have the courage of their work, and they don't you know, basically piss off their publisher to the point where they won't stock their books anywhere. Yeah,
but I mean that's not kind of a trap that you've been caught in, because you've done a lot of things that are outside, you know, the novel of the genre. You know, you've done like graphic novels.
Well, that really helps.
Plays
that really helps keep you fresh, you know, and it really helps you to feel a sense of ownership, because if you've sold 4 books ahead, that means you've got to write 4 books for them, and you don't even feel you really own those books while you're writing them. But if you do other projects, it keeps you sort of on your toes, and you think, no, this is my thing, and it's not just a career, it's a real vocation, and you know.
Yeah, so in terms of talking about, you know, keeping things fresh, when you have done multiple books that are kind of, they're not series as such, you know, like the Alex Morrow books, she is in them all, but she's not necessarily, I mean, you said in the event she's only maybe in a third of it. Yeah. You know, but when you start kind of a series like that has an arc, do you have that arc in mind at the start, and then like little things happen along the way and maybe you get thrown off in certain directions, but do you have that kind of
Actually,
overriding
with the
idea?
Alex Morrow books, I didn't, because I didn't really think she was going to be in very many books, but I really like her and I really like that form. But with the Garnet Hill books, with Maureen O'Donnell and the Garnet Hill books, I had a very definite sense of the arc.
Yeah.
And with Paddy Meehan, which I haven't finished, there's supposed to be 5 of those books, and there's only 3 so far. And I've got a very strong sense of where that arc's going, and I know in my head exactly what's going to happen to her. And I think those finite series are lovely, because actually it's a book that fat, really, when you join them all together. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with Garth Marenghi.
I'm not, no.
You're not? It's like a really silly TV show about just a sort of cult comedy show, but he was supposed to be a horror writer, and he said he was bringing a compendium of all his works, and it was Garth Marenghi's complete, and it was a book that size, and it came with its own shelf, which so Paddy Meehan books could come with their own shelf.
So you've just mentioned Paddy Meehan, and that's something that I kind of wanted to ask, because she has like a little cameo in Gods and Beasts. So she is coming back. Then you have got like a planned arc.
I'll tell you what actually happened there was, I finished Gods and Beasts, which was based on the Tommy Sheridan case, and he got out 2 days later after I handed it in, and the lawyers at the publisher said, no, we can't now publish this book because he might sue us, because he sued the News of the World. So they said, either you rewrite it in a weekend, answering all these questions from the lawyers, or we pulp it. And I said, I'll rewrite the whole thing in a weekend. Because Alex, you know, each bit of the book is not that big. So that bit of that story was maybe a third of the book. So I said, I can rewrite a third in a weekend. And one of the questions, I think question 73 was, is this a journalist who could be identified or could identify themselves from this press conference, and would they sue you? And even if you think they wouldn't sue you, they might sue you. So so I made it Pan Meehan because I made her up and I knew she wouldn't sue me. So that's the only reason she's in there.
Fantastic.
Is because I thought, I know a journalist who won't sue me. Paddy Meehan.
So kind of like drawing on that, like Alex Morrow, Paddy Meehan, female characters. You know, like you've said in the past that, you know, like like when you started writing, you know, people were kind of almost aghast that you were, you know, that you had like lead female protagonists. But like on reading your novels, at least for me, it's kind of, I mean, yes, for Alex Morrow, it's slightly more specific to her being female because she's the whole pregnancy thing and the twins, but it feels very natural. It's almost incidental that she's female. Like once you get to kind of your most recent stuff, is that kind of?
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think for people of your generation, it's not startling to see women in an active role. I just think guys are different now, but when I was young, it was. You know, you wouldn't believe how far we've come in such a short time. I mean, you know, you're about the same age as my nephew, and he's the sort of, I'd have been best, I would have moved in with him. I just think he's a brilliant guy because he's almost gender blind. Do you know what I mean? He's just not, he wouldn't make assumptions that were routine 20, 30 years ago about what women can and can't do.
Yeah, so it's just kind of like following the trends.
Exactly. I think for this generation, it's a different. Their attitude to gender is so different than people's were when I was growing up, and where it was you were a girl and you would get married. I mean, when I was a girl in the 80s, your husband could legally rape you, and you had no recourse to law, and he could also legally beat you, and so people would say to wee girls, "Do you want to get married?" Or you know, "But you can't wait to get married." And when I was a wee girl, I thought, "I am not getting married." You know, do you know what I mean? I mean, it was really, we've come such a long way, and people forget that, you know. Yeah.
Okay, so we've kind of touched on it already, but kind of the idea of you using like real cases in your novels, like is that kind of an organic process that you use to like fictionalize like a real case, or is it something that you find particularly fruitful to take like a nugget of truth and turn it into like something fictional that you can work with?
Well, I think that's I think it's partly having too much work to do and not being able to think things up, really, and I think that's like a really common theme going back through. Dickens did that, Shakespeare did that. I mean, I think it's a very common thing that writers who are crafting writers who work a lot, produce a lot of stuff, they often use real life scenarios and disguise them thinly or otherwise. But then the cases get forgotten and you just remember the story. So I think that's quite a common thing.
So I also wanted to talk. Adaptation is something that you've been involved quite a lot in, like of your own work, and you doing it to other people's work, and like taking over, say, Hellblazer, and continuing like an ongoing kind of franchise, if you like. Like starting on with The Field of Blood, which was taken and turned into like a BBC series. It's like a 2 hour like special kind of thing, and they've done The Dead Hour as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So and you've been quite kind of vocally supportive of that. Do you really think it's better than your novel? Because that's something that you've said.
Well, I think the core story about GCHQ is better. I do actually think that, and I think there's a lot of cocaine stuff in there, which doesn't really make sense to people now, because cocaine used to be so much better than it is now. Sorry, but it was a different thing back then, so that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I think, talking about there's so many current political situations in the world, whereas at that time everything was about Northern Ireland. The whole of the west of Scotland was about the Northern Ireland, and I think people are kind of a bit oblivious. I don't think it has that sort of resonance anymore. People don't really remember it that well. It doesn't make an awful lot of sense. So those books are very much about those things, and so I think it has made them much more current, you know. And but a lot of that is about, I'm being very indiscreet, a lot of that is about Davy Kane, the writer, right, doesn't do publicity, right? So I've ended up doing his publicity for him because he doesn't like it, he really doesn't like it, and he doesn't want to be a big brand. And I think he is a brilliant writer.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you heard that he was involved, because he's got a very kind of rich background, he's done, Taggart, and he's done Rebus, he's done, a whole load of stuff.
He's a movie director, he wrote his own films. His own films are amazing. And then he had a kid and a bad film, and then he stopped. Right, and then he ended up writing Taggart. People were like, Davy Kane's doing Taggart. He was going to be Scotland's Scorsese, but he kind of bottled out, and when he had a family. And he's an absolutely brilliant writer, and he isn't given credit because he hasn't got, he hasn't got a brand. Do you know what I mean? He doesn't have a mental haircut, and he doesn't do lots of telly. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I sort of bigged it up, particularly because I think Davy Kane needs to be recognised as a writer, and you shouldn't have to go out and sell yourself, and people who can't do that shouldn't be forgotten. So that was one of the reasons for the hyperbole.
So how early did you hear that he was like, that David Kane was going to be involved, that like David Morrissey and Jade Johnson, who got the BAFTA, the Scottish BAFTA for Best Actor or Actress in a crime series, I think it was.
Oh, and just in
a general series, and of course Peter Capaldi's in the first series as well. Yeah. So I mean, did that reassure you as to the kind of like the quality that it was going to be?
Well, not really, because there's so many variables in that, and any kind of TV show, I know a lot of people who make TV or make films, and it's like, we've got this person and that person, so-and-so's doing the sound, this person's doing the set design, and it's all set to be brilliant, and it's awful. Yeah. So there's so many variables. Until you actually see the thing, you don't know. You just don't know. So, and I've sold the books I've sold the rights for every book I've ever written multiple times, and every time you meet people on TV or film, this is definitely getting made and it's going to be the best thing ever. And the first time you believe them, and the second time you think, I think I've heard someone say that before, and the third time you think, yeah mate, that'll definitely happen. And then by the sixth or seventh time you just think, yeah, well, we'll see. So I was amazed that it was good. I mean, I feel really lucky, because I think lots of people don't have that experience.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of authors out there that feel very kind of
aggrieved.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Alex Morrow, is getting a 6-part series.
Yeah,
is
no,
that
it's
right?
Do you know it's Scott Free, actually, Terry Scott's company. The people that did like Gladiator and all that, and they're wanting to develop, but they're just developing it. Do you know? I mean, it might never happen, but they want to develop a great big long like sort of Sopranos type story line about Alex and Danny, and about the whole city. So it's going to be about the whole city. So it's not going to be a crime every week solved every night, so it's going to be a sort of sprawling look at the way the city works and all the different power pockets within the city and stuff like that.
Story arcs rather than like standalone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, good. Moving on to kind of adaptation that you've done yourself. Obviously, you've Stieg Larsson's Millennium Trilogy with The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo has already been released, yes?
Yeah.
So transitioning that, from novel to graphic novel, is that was that a very different experience for you? Because obviously you've got to work kind of very closely with the artist. It's a very kind of visual medium. How was that?
Well, I think you try and visualise it, and then you write a script as tight as you can. So you have to lay out the panels on the page, and then see what the image is, and then see what the dialogue is, and say, you know, how the panels work together. So you could have a big panel, a small panel, and a little panel, and that could be, you know, moving in on someone's eye or something. So you write a very tight script, and then you send it to the artist, and they kind of send you back and forth all their different panels, and you comment on them. And then the lettering happens. So, I mean, it's a really long process, you know, with lots and lots of people. So you've got the artist, the colourist, and the lettering, and you've got the editing as well. And it's a bit chaotic. I don't really know how it works.
So was it kind of a similar experience for you for doing, you know, like Hellblazer? Because you'd already had that kind of experience.
Hellblazer
before.
Was just one artist. This is two artists, and a lot of money involved. So everybody wants to piss on the post, seeing as, and so everybody wants to get their name in. And but Hellblazer, I mean, I think by that point DC Comics weren't cool then, right?
Yeah.
So a guy at DC said, you know, I really like your books, and I'm probably going to leave soon. Do you want to write Hellblazer for a year? And so they just let me do whatever I wanted.
Yeah. Did you, like, going into that, did you have a sense of, like, the kind of almost, like, where that character had come from? You know, like, how long it had been running?
They send you every comic that's ever been published about Constantine, and you have to sit and read every Hellblazer ever. And then people come in and you say, you're sitting reading a comic, and you say, I'm working. It's brilliant. But they send you everything.
Yeah.
And so you read the whole thing as a Bible, and then you build the character on top of that.
So did that help for you, or does that add kind of a weight, a pressure?
Oh no, because comics weren't a big thing then, you know, and also most of the people I know are publishing people, and they thought comics were for people who couldn't read. Yeah. So I would say, you know, I'm writing Hellblazer, and there were no wows. Yeah. There was, in fact, Christopher Brookmeyer and Ian Rankin were the only people who were impressed, and they were so sincerely impressed. They said, "How did you get that?"
Like, obviously the Constantine character has kind of in part come from, like, Alan Moore, who's, you know, kind of the great figures of graphic novels, you know, like Watchmen, like V for Vendetta, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Were you aware of that? Were you kind of almost like scared to kind of change too much? Because obviously you've taken Constantine.
He was just a mad, smelly hippie. When I started writing Constantine, I mean, so that was like 7 years ago, and he and Neil Gaiman have gone through this sort of generational transformation into demigods. Yeah. But that they weren't then. They were just sort of like, oh, that guy Alan Moore, he's done some brilliant stuff, you know. Yeah. To be honest, I was more into Garth Ennis. Which is a shameful thing to say, but, you know, I'm not that into fantasy. I really like Alan Moore's politics, but you know, I think his sexual politics stuff is a bit mental. But you know, they weren't like gods or anything like that then. They were just like guys who were doing good work. Although if you went abroad, people would say, you know, I once touched his hem. But they were kind of too familiar to be regarded as... I mean, it's funny how quickly those things can change. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. They can really change, and it is about another generation coming up and finding Sandman and finding Watchmen and really, you know, becoming really significant. I mean, there is a drip feed into the culture, and but I just really liked his work, and, you know, I actually really love Swamp Thing. So yeah,
and of course there's all the movies that have come off, you know, like Watchmen and V for
Vendetta.
See,
that's it. Yeah.
But I mean, and obviously Alan Moore's kind of really distanced himself from all of them. But it does kind of raise the profile. You know,
there's money in it, and that changes the cultural profile of things. So comics were, you know, boring things written by middle-aged obsessive men for other middle-aged obsessive men, and DC asking me to write Hellblazer was the start of a bit of a revolution. They started asking people from outside the forum to come in and write them, and they started supporting people who were not comic fanboys to write comics. And you know, the change in they've gone from selling, like, you know, 1 million graphic novels a year maybe 5 years ago, and now it's 8 million, and they're in Waterstones. I mean, that's unbelievable. That they're
huge sections.
Huge section, and that's about movies and about the fact that people are interested, and the fact that people know how to read comics. People didn't know how to read comics then, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same even when books are, you know, like, put into film. You see all the book covers re-released with, you know, like Game of Thrones with Sean Bean's face in the front of it. You know? So it is the same. Also, I wondered if you were aware of this, but Empire Magazine ran a article which was titled 10 Best Hellblazer Stories
All right.
Ever. And your empathy of the enemy was picked out
off,
in
really?
particular.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No
So,
way,
I'll
really?
just tell you that in case.
When was that?
That was just last week. They were running
Fuck
stuff
off,
because
that's
there's a TV adaptation of Hellblazer underway, and they're kind of picking out the things that people. Yeah.
Oh my
Apparently, I
God.
didn't know if you knew, so I thought I'd say.
All my friends are in that comic.
Yeah.
My partner is the leader of the cult on Colonsay. My best friend Chris Cole is like a sort of shit-stirring little git in the background, because I never thought I would ever get to write another comic, so I put all my pals in it.
Yeah.
So I hope they use everyone's names, because I hope they make it and use everyone's, because that would be so surreal to have all my friends.
Group viewing would be awkward, probably.
What?
The group viewing would be awkward.
That'd be hilarious.
So, just stick with Hellblazer for a little bit. Constantine, you've taken him, and obviously your story takes place in Glasgow. Is that, and obviously a lot of your novels are associated with Glasgow. Was that a conscious thing again? You going back to something that you knew that was authentic, that you could represent in the city? Because obviously you had to think about, the visual art of it as well. Was that a conscious thing, or was that just that'll be a fun thing to do?
No, it was really conscious, and because I think Glasgow's very unseen visually. I think Scotland's very unseen.
Yeah.
Dundee's very unseen. You go somewhere like New York and it's familiar already.
Yeah.
But Scotland is very startling and very odd, and even things like I'm writing a book set in Helensburgh at the moment, and Helensburgh is an absolutely beautiful Victorian town that was plagued by gang warfare. And it was all these fat guys in minicabs driving about listening to Tupac and fiddling. That is inherently hilarious.
Yeah.
But it's totally unseen, and there must be all these, do you know what I mean? I think visually Glasgow is very startling and a very strange kind of city, and that view when you come over the Kingston Bridge and it looks as if everything's pressed up. As if the whole city's tumbling towards you, and
because that whole kind of riverside along the Clyde is quite distinct now.
Yeah.
You've got the science centre and the bridge. And, it's quite kind of, it could become iconic in a sort
it really could. Yeah. And but just to use somewhere that people didn't really know, and I was very, very pregnant then, so I thought if I set it close by, and it was being drawn by an Argentinian artist. So I had to take a lot of photographs to get the architecture right to send to him, and I didn't want to have to stray too far. Although I was climbing over building sites, massively pregnant with a camera to take pictures, and they were building all these houses up at Park Circus, and the guys who worked there gave me a hard hat and they let me climb over loads and loads of stuff. You could see they were a bit scared sometimes because they were thinking, this isn't just a civilian, it's a massively pregnant civilian.
So, just maybe going back a little bit. I'm as I've told you, I'm from Ayrshire, so I'm quite kind of interested in a lot of like the colloquialisms that you have in your novels, and I had kind of picked out. There's a part in Gods and Beasts where and I wanted to ask, how important is it to be very kind of specific about the dialect, about the language? Because there's a part where you're describing it's a Greenock Irish accent and like lower working class, wide open mouth vowels from the west coast. Does that kind of feed into the same idea of Glasgow about authenticity and about like representing something that you know?
A wee bit, but I think it's Morrow saying that, and so what she's showing you there is that she's very astute and she can read people.
You've got the bit that I haven't included there is the Birmingham twang that's also there, and
so I think it's showing something about the character rather than just about the accent. But when I came to live in Glasgow from London, what I really loved was the lyrical way people spoke, and I don't think people here are aware of how lyrically they speak, or the emphasis on rhythm in the way people speak and the way people, and a lot of, particularly in the West Coast, a lot of the rhythms that people use are Gaelic rhythms. Yeah. So how are you yourself? That's a direct translation from Gaelic, and so I really wanted to sort of capture that, because I think it's not that. I mean, if you look at something like The Wire. What's really interesting about that, even if you watch it with the subtitles, is the rhythm, how people inject rhythm through swearing, or just the way they order phrases, and that's so regionally specific, and it's something you don't see represented very much, and it's very beautiful.
Yeah, well, swearing's quite a kind of interesting one, because you can kind of take it rhythmically, and it's it's something that has become reasonably popular, reasonably you know accessible. You know, because you've got like the whole urban Welsh kind of craze with train spotting and filth, etc. So is that something that happened naturally for you? You don't feel like you have to force kind of
swearing?
Yeah, profanity or anything into it?
Not really.
No, yeah, right.
No. I mean, I swear like a trooper. I'm better now because I've got kids, you know, and so I do find myself bowlerising swear words.
In terms of character,
I think it's really important.
Does it all just kind of come from you the way you would?
No, I think you have to work out what's that character. What sort of background are they from? Would they have heard cursing?
Yeah.
Would they use it just for rhythm?
Yeah.
If a well-spoken character says, "For fuck's sake," that's a big statement.
Yeah.
Whereas if someone swears every second word, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I think you have to sort of have an ear for rhythms and the way people talk. And I think swearing is is a way of injecting rhythm. I don't think it's meant to offend.
Yeah.
We always talk about how offensive swearing is, but we don't talk about the rhythm that it introduces to a sentence. So you can say, the fridge is full, or you can say, the fucking fridge is fucking full, and that's a very different sort of rhythm.
Yeah,
you know?
Got a lot of alliteration there already.
A lot of alliteration, and it's like fuck off full. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, if you actually put down the way people properly speak, it would look like gobbledygook.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people speak in half sentences, and if you read police transcripts, it doesn't make any. You have to kind of try and hear what they're saying. I was like, because it's word for word, and I was kind of like that. But do you know what I mean? And then I was because there's so many fillers in there, Anyway, yeah. So I think you have to listen to people, and when you hear and phones are great for that because you can sit on a bus and listen to people.
Yeah.
Because people shout their lives down the phone, whereas they never used to. They used to be quite guarded in public,
So, yeah, talking about kind of, you said something in the event about the Millennium Trilogy being very hard to edit down, or
needed
editing down. Was that kind of, does that give you quite a lot of sympathy for these screenwriters who have to approach your work, other people's work, and get them into this kind of filmable thing?
But it's a different form, so
it's a different
thing, and so you have to say make something out of that. You don't say pare out the bits you don't like or don't work and use that, but you have to say make a different thing out of it, and that's so you have to respect that, and you have to say to them, you make something, don't try and make what you imagine I would make, but you make your own thing out of it. And I think that's when people make good work. It's when you trust them and trust them to use their skills to make something else.